transboundary report of the world to discuss experiences in diffusing tensions, sharing the common good, build trust, and develop collaboration and cooperation. Next slide. This webinar is organized by Florida International University Institute of Environment along the UNESCO Chair on Sustainable Water Security at FIU, Addis Ababa Institute of Technology at Addis Ababa University, Bahar Dar Institute of Technology at Bahar Dar University, Nile Basin Discourse, and Water and Land Resource Center at Addis Ababa University. Next slide. Today's talk is given by Mekdelawit Messay, and the topic is evaluating international transboundary water management practices or contextual lessons for the Nile Basin. And this will be very useful for the Nile Basin to see what other transboundary basins agreements look like, and that experience can be shared for developing transboundary water management for the Nile Basin. Next slide. Our presentation, Mekdelawit Messay is a PhD student at Florida International University. Next slide. A brief introduction of her bio will be, her research focuses on long-term sustainable and equitable utilization of transboundary water resources with a specific interest in the Nile Basin. She has a Bachelor of Science in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Addis Ababa Institute of Technology in Ethiopia, a Master of Science in Environmental Science from Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and a Master of Science in Hydraulic Engineering from Addis Ababa Institute of Technology in Ethiopia. Mekdelawit is actively involved in the Nile water use discussion, especially as it relates to the Grande Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. She has done her master's thesis on equitable and reasonable use of the Nile River, written several opinion pieces, and contributed to numerous panel discussions on the topic. Besides her academic engagement in the Nile, Mekdelawit is also involved in social advocacy around the Nile Basin, working to eliminate multiple stories and narratives across the basin and fostering dialogue with the hope of bringing people together, creating a shared understanding, empathy, and culture of peace in the basin. Again, her title is Evaluating International Transboundary Water Management Practices or Contextual Lessons for the Nile Basin. Next slide. And the moderator for today is myself. Next slide, please. Upcoming talks. The next talk will be on October 8th by Dr. Asad Shamseldin. He's Associate Professor at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And his topic will be the Grande Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD, underreported issues on GERD impacts on the Sudan. Next slide. As always, these presentations will be video recorded and posted for everybody to see both the presentation and the slides. Please mute your microphone for the duration of the presentation. Unmute only to ask questions after the presentation ends, and it is time for Q&A. You can send also chat to me on your questions or comments. Next slide, if there is. This is the slide, okay. Now I leave the forum for Mekdelawit to start her presentation. At the end, there will be questions and answers, and we'll have enough time for discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Wossenu. Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year, I have to say, for all the Ethiopians, Eritreans, and everyone who celebrates the Ethiopian New Year by extension. As mentioned earlier, I'm a PhD student working on transboundary water management, and my specific area of interest is, of course, the Nile Basin. This presentation that I'm about to give today was a presentation and a reading born out of frustration, right? So we see transboundary waters everywhere. Transboundary waters are not unique to the Nile Basin. They're everywhere, as we'll see later on. They're very ubiquitous. And so you think that given the amount of time that we spend managing waters, you would think that we would have by now some sort of arrangement, some sort of management where we can which we can learn from and which we can essentially use wisely, smartly for the management of transboundary waters everywhere, but that's not the case in the Nile Basin. And so it was in the hopes of finding out, okay, what was working elsewhere, what was not working elsewhere, can these practices and lessons be applied in the Nile Basin, or do we need to contextualize them? What are they? It was in the hopes of finding this out that I did this reading. And I should also start by saying this is not a prescriptive presentation. I'm not saying, hey, these things are what we should adopt in the Nile Basin to solve all the problems that we have. But my point in this presentation is to showcase what was working out there, what wasn't working out there, and to sort of infer the things that we can do by learning from other basins in the world to hopefully move the conversation, move the dialogue, move the management practices in the Nile Basin 1, 2, 3 steps further. With that said, I'll move on to my slides, my presentations. So as I mentioned earlier, transboundary waters are nothing new. They're not specific to the Nile. They're ubiquitous. We have more than 276 transboundary waters, and I've seen this number rise to 310 in a recent presentation. And if we consider groundwater resources too, we have more than 300 transboundary aquifers. All this area that you see in blue, those are areas covered by transboundary waters. So they're everywhere. They account for almost 47% of the Earth's surface. So half of the Earth's surface half of the globe lies in transboundary water basins. They serve 40% of the global population in terms of water demand, and just by water accounting, they account for 57, almost 60% of the global freshwater supply. Country-wise, political boundaries-wise, out of the 195 countries in the world that we have, 153 of them, more than 70%, 74% to be precise, have parts or all of their states in transboundary waters, right? So either way, 70% of the world has to deal with the management of transboundary water management, whether they be dependent on it or not, just by virtue of their territories being in these transboundary waters. Out of these 153, 30 countries completely lie within the basin. So this is just to show you how widespread the issue of transboundary water management is, how widespread and ubiquitous transboundary waters are. So given that we've had so much time, almost 3,000 years since the earliest non-modern times of transboundary water management, and transboundary water management being spread out all over the world, you would believe that, or you would assume that we would have a hang of how to manage transboundary waters. But the fact of the matter is still 2/3 of transboundary waters everywhere still do not have a cooperative management framework. This is not to say that we haven't done anything. We have progressed a lot in terms of concretizing the kind of principles and the kind of rules and basis that transboundary waters nowadays is based on. We're not dealing with doctrines such as absolute territorial sovereignty, which gives undue rights to upstream countries, essentially saying you can use all the water that you want regardless of the impact downstream, or absolute territorial integrity, which is the flip side of the absolute territorial sovereignty, which gives downstream countries unlimited access to water, saying downstream countries are entitled to the natural flow of the water, essentially stating upstream countries cannot use it. We're not dealing with these principles anymore. Even prior appropriation, the doctrine of prior appropriation, which essentially says first come, first serve, even though it's applicable in some areas of the world, we're not dealing with that when we talk about transboundary waters. For the most part, the entire world, everyone now at least conceptually agrees that the principle of equitable and reasonable use, the principle of causing no significant harm, and the duty to cooperate form the basis for transboundary water management. Everybody agrees that since the 1960s and from the Helsinki rules and then all the way to the 1997 UN Convention, 1992 UN ECE Convention, the world essentially agrees on the basic premise of how to manage transboundary waters. But this agreement has not translated to usable, useful management frameworks, as we can see, because 2/3 of the world still do not have a management framework. And this map is a bit counterintuitive because the yellow and the green, they show areas where transboundary water management and agreements are not prevalent, and the red is areas where transboundary water management agreements are prevalent. So you would expect to see more red, not more yellow and green, for things to be better, and red is generally danger. So this is a bit of a counterintuitive map, but if you reframe that for a bit, so the most of the world here, as you can see, is green, blue, and yellow, and that's very low to moderate levels of basin-wide agreements or management frameworks being in place for transboundary water management, right? So that's not good. This is the situation that we have to deal with, and so, because of this widespread issues with transboundary water management, there have been some school of thoughts. Very many people are prone to thinking of water as a source of conflict, essentially water shared between different countries, water crossing political boundaries to be a source of conflict. And the Pacific Institute actually has a very fascinating website. It's called, you can find it at www.waterworld.org/conflicts. And it essentially documents chronologically all the water conflicts, all the issues that it deems to be water conflicts, all the way going back to 3000 BC. And according to this website, there have been 926 recorded conflicts or water-related conflicts since 3000 BC. Now, that might not sound like a lot because this website includes all events such as the parting of the Red Sea from the Bible stories, or ancient fights between water in the Sumerian kingdoms. All of those are included in this ones, but what we can see from this database or from this map is, one, the conflicts are spread out more or less evenly. There is some difference in the density of conflicts that we see, and of course, the Nile Basin, the Middle East, Southeastern Asia, they're a bit more densely populated in terms of conflict than the rest of the world, but for the most part, it is more evenly spread out, which means conflicts around water are also not an issue or not a behavior of a certain area of the world. They're ubiquitous. But what you can see if you really see the breakdown of the data is, out of the 926 conflicts that this database documents, more than 2/3, more than 600 of them happened after the year 2000. Now, this is not to say that we've had more conflicts since the 2000s. That's definitely one hypothesis. Other hypothesis can be where we have had more reporting, conflicts are more visible these days. All of that taken into consideration, it is worth observing that recently, especially since the 1900s, conflicts over water have escalated way more than they have been at any time in history. And this makes sense, especially considering the history of use of transboundary waters. Back in the days, transboundary waters were able to fulfill all the needs of transboundary, all the needs of riparian states, because our population and our needs were not that extensive. Nature was able to cater for our needs and demands. And during the Middle Ages, so the 16th century and 17th century, the role of transboundary waters was more for navigation and and transport than consumptive uses such as hydropower, irrigation, industrial water use. So the conflicts around that, there were very few conflicts, as you can see, 12 conflicts, so from zero, so that is like zero after Christ till 18th century, 17th and 19th century, 1799, only 12 conflicts documented, because the use was not consumptive, the use was not for domestic purposes, irrigation, hydropower demands, but for navigation. And it is extremely, significantly much more easier to manage the navigation aspects, as we can see in the history of the navigation laws on transboundary waters, than to manage consumptive uses, than to manage industrial use, domestic use, hydropower uses of these transboundary waters. So this data does make sense. It does make sense that when the use of transboundary waters, when the purpose of transboundary waters shifted from navigation to consumptive uses, to domestic uses, to industrial uses, more conflicts were observed, because obviously this puts countries in tension, because these uses are consumptive, as the word implies. They use the water. Not to mention the population has increased dramatically since the 1750s, since after the Industrial Revolution, right? So the balance between nature being able to provide for the needs and the wants of the entire globe versus the population stress, that's not in balance anymore. And so the combination of these two things, so conflicts being reported more, population increase, related increase in water demands, added to the purpose of transboundary waters changing from non-consumptive uses or navigational uses to consumptive uses, that could account for the increase in conflicts that we can see in this database. But there's also another school of thought that says, no, water is not necessarily a source of conflict, but it can be a source of collaboration. And I find that this is a very optimistic way of looking at it. And the rationale goes that because transboundary waters, and because the need for water is very universal, and because transboundary waters are ubiquitous, we can't afford to go into conflict situations. And so the situation forces us to collaborate, which I think has been the case and has been the case in many areas of the world. But in my opinion, and I'm sure most of you would agree, it's a bit of both, right? So water can be a source of conflict, but it's also a very big cause for collaboration. And it's on the hopes that water can be a basis of collaboration that we do this presentation, we do this talks, we do this webinars, that dialogue and communication can bring us together. Lessons from other transboundary basins can be contextualized for them. That research output, science, techniques, these can help the conversation to move forward. Because water is a basic necessity, water is a human right, and collaboration is not a luxury that we can afford. It's not a luxury that we can afford not to choose, but a necessity in this case. So now, as we mentioned earlier, transboundary waters are everywhere. And so by virtue of their number, we have many experiences to learn what to do and what not to do. Even though we only a third of the transboundary basins in the world have a cooperative framework, we still have a lot of experiences to learn from, good practices to learn from, also many practices to see what not to do, right? What are the pitfalls? What are the things to avoid? What are the processes, or what are the sequence of events which lead to a productive transboundary water corporation, and what are not? It doesn't have to be trial and error anymore, right? Like the advantage of being late to the party is that you can learn from others. We don't have to make the same mistakes that the other basins did. We can actually learn from them. So it doesn't have to be a trial and error process. We can have informed ways forward. It doesn't mean we have to copy paste or lessons or pitfalls from other transboundary basins into the Nile, but no, we can inform our ways. We can contextualize these lessons that we get from other basins and apply it to the Nile Basin in a way that is suited to the socioeconomic, historical, and physical realities in the basin. So rather than trial and error, we can have an informed way forward. And I stress on this point, contextualization, that is absolutely necessary. it's often the case in international relations and international work that whatever works somewhere, it will just going to be, well, the tendency is just to scale it out everywhere and try and see that if it works, right? And our experiences so far, not just in transboundary waters, but in any development endeavor, has shown us that contextualization, making sure interventions are suited to the socioeconomic and socioeconomic realities and facts on the ground, not just facts now, history, the psyche of people, all of that, it needs to take into consideration all of that before we copy paste benefits or lessons or good practices that have worked elsewhere. So contextualization is absolutely necessary. The sizes of the basin that we're talking about matters. It's different when talking about a basin like the Nile Basin, a big basin like the Nile Basin, versus other smaller basins which have, let's say, 2 or 3 countries, versus a basin like the Nile, like the Nile, which has like 11 countries, right? The amount of water in question also makes things different. The Nile Basin, it's a very big basin, but for its size, it doesn't have a lot of water. The average is around well, the number that we know is 84 billion cubic meters, but research has raised that to 90, 92, sometimes 100 billion cubic meters. That is nowhere near compared to other basins in the world, let's say Congo, the Amazon, right, where the flow is in thousands of cubic meters a year. So the amount of water that we're talking about actually dictates the kind of interventions that we can bring into to the ground. Economic status of countries, right? Just because a certain intervention worked in Southeast Asia or in Latin America or even North America doesn't mean it's going to work here. The economic status, the power balance between the countries, that has to be taken into consideration. What is the primary purpose of the water? Is it just being used for environmental purposes, industrial uses, or is it being used to fulfill basic necessities such as food, water, energy? This also dictates whether the kind of interventions that we can bring from outside. Historical and political context, right? We all know that Nile Basin has a rich history and also a very sad, a very bad traumatic history. Colonialism has a big role to play in water management in the Nile Basin. So we have to take into account the historical baggage, the political baggage, the power dynamics between the countries, the dominant use of the water in the basin before we start copy-pasting lessons or avoiding pitfalls that have worked or haven't worked in other basins. So it is important to analyze what has worked out there. It is important to draw lessons from other transboundary basins out there, but it's also extremely important to make sure that contextualization, making sure the interventions that we recommend are tailored to the facts on the ground in the Nile Basin before we move on with any intervention. Okay, so moving on with good practices, I start from the Messay Treaty, and I like this treaty I really like this treaty and appreciate this treaty because I think, in my opinion, it was way ahead of its time. So the Messay Treaty was an agreement that happened between 2 ancient Sumerian city-states that are called Lagesh and Umma. And this happened in 2500 BC before Christ, right? So 3,000 years ago. And many, according to many research outputs, this treaty is the world's first legal document. So that's an achievement in its own. But the important thing that we have to learn from this treaty, and it was done to sort of manage how these 2 city-states, Lagesh and Umma, used the waters of the Euphrates and the Tigris back in the days of the ancient Sumerian city-states, in the ancient Sumerian civilization days. And so it was basically a mechanism of water allocation between these two city-states. But what's interesting about this treaty is beyond just physical water allocation, it included mechanisms such as land lease, where Lagesh or Umma would lease a land in the other territory and use it, and then it introduced annual tenancy fees and a crop sharing scheme for land that was cultivated by one of the city-states, Umma, and the other's territory as part of the mechanism of water allocation. So even then, back in 2500 BC, even then they knew knew that hardcore physical concrete water allocation would not cut it, right? That's why they introduced these mechanisms, which we are striving to adopt in this modern days: crop sharing scheme, annual land tenancy fees, land lease fees, as part of the water allocation, right? Because just dividing the physical water is not enough. We need to integrate trading, virtual water trade, which I am a big proponent of. We need to trade. We need to have an integrated way of using the water. We need to capitalize the best resources of the water. So this treaty, which happened in 2500 BC, understood that physical water allocation would not cut it, and they did introduce other mechanisms to support water allocation. It was also important to see that in this Messay treaty was also a border treaty. It delineated the border between Lagash and Uma. So when it delineated the border stones, what they did was to follow the hydraulic lines. To follow the border stones should confirm the boundary between these two states. The boundary between these two city-states would follow the irrigation canals along these two city-states. And this is a very smart thing to do, because when political boundaries of countries crosses hydraulic boundaries, that's when the problem happens. And these people were smart enough to ensure that their political boundaries run along the hydraulic boundaries, minimizing the amount of conflicts they would go to. Now, as good as I make this treaty to sound like, it was actually the bridge of this treaty that resulted in the world's first water war back in 2477 BC. And this the fighting between Lagash and Uma is documented as one of the first instances where two cities actually fought over water. But it does have important lessons to draw from. And the pictures that you see up here, they are inscriptions of the treaty in the Mesopotamian language, cuneiform. And you can actually see this rock forms in the Louvre in Paris. It's quite fascinating, I find it. But the element of making sure that the political boundary follows the hydrological boundary, even though it's too late for the modern world to follow that, and introduction of elements of trade and collaborative use in addition to physical water allocation. These are basic things that we can take from the Messay Treaty, and these elements were really ahead of their time, because we're still struggling now, 3,000 years later, 4,500, 5,000 years later, we're still struggling to adopt these into our general psyche or general principle of water management. Moving on, let's go to the Senegal and the Niger River Basin to see what these are two of the most exemplary river basins in the world, the best case practices that are raised in the world. So the Senegal River Basin, right here, it's not a very big basin. It's composed of Senegal, Mali, Mauritania, and Guinea. The Niger River Basin, that's a big one. So it's all of this area here. It includes more countries. So Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, Cote d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast as it was called, Guinea, Mali, Niger, and Nigeria. Now, these two river basins, they're one of the best case practices anywhere in the world. They're the examples that are raised as examples of co-owned infrastructures, as examples of cooperation, as examples of strong regional river basin institutes. So what happened in Senegal River Basin was in the 70s, right after these countries gained their independence from France. In the 70s, they had a very severe drought, the Sahel drought in the 70s, and it ravaged most of these countries that you see here. So when they got out of that drought, they had this common commitment to make sure that such incidents don't happen, such ravages, such atrocities because of a natural incidents don't happen. And the first thing that they did was to capitalize on the shared resources that they had. Water. Senegal River Basin is shared by 4 countries, Senegal, Mali, Mauritania, and Guinea. These countries have differing interests, obviously. Senegal many of them are interested in irrigation. Hydropower is a big player. Navigation is also a big player. Flood control is a big issue in the Senegal River Basin. So what they did was come together, form the OMVS. So it's a French abbreviation, but it translates to the Senegal River Basin Development Organization, a very strong river basin organization, I I call it a basin organization with teeth, with power, a basin organization who's able to move things, not just symbolically there to foster communications. So they have a long history of cooperation dating back to the colonial times. And the fact that these countries, all of these countries were colonized by the French, and they had that common history, actually served to reinforce their collaboration, served to reinforce their union. And they came together, formed a very strong river basin organization, also an ABN, Authority of the Niger Basin Authority, and the Niger organization. And they made an evolving water management practice, which is adaptable to circumstances. What these basins are mainly known for are their co-owned infrastructures. However, the Diama and the Manantali dams in Senegal River basins, they were established to ensure that irrigation demands, hydropower demands, navigation demands, and flood control demands of these countries involved in the basins, and they were co-owned. The cost of these infrastructures were borne by these countries together. The Manantali Dam, for example, it's located in Mali, but it's co-owned by the three of the four basin countries, in the Senegal River basins. The Diama Dam, that's between Senegal and, if I'm not mistaken, Senegal and Mali. And also it's a flood control infrastructure, it's a hydropower infrastructure, and these co-owned infrastructures work really, really well. And another interesting things about these two basins is they established water as a human right. It's not an economic commodity to be traded between these two countries. No, water was a human right. And this was a huge departure from the direction the world was taking and during those times, because establishing water as a human right, as cliche and as obvious as it seems, it has implications for how we use the water, right? You can't trade the water. You can't just trade the water for money as if it's an economic commodity. That understanding has to be there that everybody has the basic human right to water. And they established it, they chronicled it in their working framework. They also embraced integrated water management at their core, at the core of their practice, which is why you see many of these infrastructures are multi-purposes, right? They're not just there for irrigation, they're not just there for hydropower, but they were designed with the idea of integrated water resource management, and they do serve multiple purposes. And again, as I mentioned earlier, these countries capitalized on critical moments such as, like, for example, droughts, times of extreme water scarcity, times of extreme flooding impacts. These critical moments, as bad as they sound, they can be important turning points in basins. I also believe that the Nile Basin is at a turning point right now, with this discussion around the GERD and this increased momentum to talk about equitable and reasonable uses. What these countries in the Senegal and the Niger River Basin did was to capitalize on that critical moment, that critical momentum of the time, and to move things forward. And so now they're one of the best case scenarios, the best practices, the best practices praised around the world for how they manage their water. Another African basin that we can think about is the Orange Senku River. So it is this large basin in Southern Africa, and it includes countries such as Botswana, Namibia, Lesotho, and South Africa. Again, this basin is really praised for an inclusive organization. So the Orascom, or Orange Senku River Basin, was established by all riparians. This is something that we can learn from. Of course, the NBI is there in the Nile Basin now with all of the countries in there but for most of our history, inclusion, actually having an inclusive system, was an issue in the Nile Basin. And the Orange Senku River Basin is praised for being inclusive. Even the Senegal and Niger River Basins weren't completely inclusive when they first started, right? So the Senegal River Basin Commission did not include Guinea, but it later joined on. Here also, Botswana was not part of the Orange Senku River Basin, but right after they joined. So they have a very inclusive organization. And another key thing, striking thing about the Orange-Seku River is they holistically adopted the international transboundary water principles, mainly the Helsinki and the UN. And if you go through their documents, if you go through their readings, they explicitly say they use the Helsinki and the UN rules and the international principle as a basis of managing their transboundary waters, which is quite striking because we don't see that happening everywhere in the world. You can see indications, you can see points, you can see like directions or inferences to the international principles, but I haven't seen any. I haven't seen any that pointedly directs to the international principles, mainly the Helsinki and the UN, and that has its benefits. The way forward is more clear-cut when you follow an already carved pathway, right? And this basin is also known for its collaborative benefit sharing projects. The most famous one is the Lesotho Highland project that I'm sure most of you know. There's this dam that Lesotho and South Africa share, which provides hydropower and foreign currency for Lesotho, and provides drinking water supply, freshwater supply for South Africa, and where South Africa in turn pays royalty for the benefits it gets from Lesotho. Now, the way the benefit sharing works in the Orange-Seku River versus how it works in the Senegal River is a bit different. In the Senegal River, the dam, the Manantali, the Diama Dam, they were co-owned. The cost of the infrastructure was shared between these countries. But coming to the Orange-Seku River, they share the benefits, they pay for the benefits. But when the dam was built, Lesotho was fully responsible for the financial burdens of the dam. They did get international help. And this is a case where international community can actually be helpful in moving the management and moving the communication, the dialogue in a transboundary basin issue forward. And this is a very good case of that. But for all intensive purposes, the dam is located in Lesotho. Lesotho is responsible for the financial burdens of the dam, but in turn, for the benefits, in turn, it would get paid. It would have royalties for the amount of water that it gave to South Africa. So different modalities of sharing benefits, sharing infrastructure, but still all the same. They do get the benefits. They have been living collaboratively, peacefully, and this is also one of the best practices that we hear out there, right? Like the Lesotho Highland water projects. Information sharing was a key part of it. And I would say information sharing, as we'll see later on, is also a key aspect in most transboundary basin practices. But information sharing went both ways. It wasn't Lesotho just giving to South Africa or South Africa just giving to Lesotho. Mutual exchange of information was critical in making sure this collaboration worked in the Orange-Seku River. If you also look at the spirit of how the cooperation or how their collaboration works, there was a genuine concern for each other's demands. If you look at the documents, the letters that were back and forth between South Africa and Lesotho, you could see in the spirit of the letters, in the spirit of the agreements, there was a genuine concern and demand for each other's demands and claims. And this is in stark contrast to what we see in the Nile Basin from all sides, I have to say. There is this disregard for the use and the demands of some countries, and there's extreme portrayal of other countries being dependent or other countries not needing the water. There was none of that here. And as we will see later on, this is also a recurring theme. When there is genuine understanding, genuine concern, genuine demands for each other claims, it makes the process easier. And they engaged in this joint project, which provided foreign currency and energy for Lesotho and also water supply for South Africa. And as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the few cases where international support was actually helpful in moving the conversation and the management forward. Moving out of Africa, one of the most famous case studies is the issue between the case study of Mexico and the US in the management of the Colorado, Tijuana, and Rio Grande River Basin. So this treaty was signed in 1944. But the most fascinating thing about this treaty, at least for me, is that it is an evolving treaty. We're still talking about it today, and especially in light of all the drought that's been happening in Colorado, and how the drought management mechanisms of this treaty are being invoked now to manage the water scarcity that's happening. It is a big showcase, a big exemplary treaty of how evolving treaties which are not rigid, but which are flexible and adaptable to the changing circumstances in the basin, can be beneficial. So as I mentioned earlier, it was signed in 1944, so more than 80 years, 70 years ago, but it has been evolving, and the evolution or the adaptations are documented in minutes. So one of the famous minutes, minute 319, that was adopted in 2012. And so this agreement between the US and Mexico actually allocates X amount of water to Mexico, Y amounts of water to the US. We do this and that when drought happens. But in 2010, there was an earthquake in Mexico, and infrastructures in Mexico were damaged, and Mexico was not able to sort of to do its duties according to the 1944 agreement. And this minute 319 was there to make sure that Mexico was accommodated for during this time of crisis, to rebuild its infrastructures, and to sort of develop a mechanism where Mexico would eventually give back the water it owes to the US, right? So this is one of the ways, but this is one of the ways in which a treaty can be adaptable. It's not hard cut. It's not, no, we said this and that in the treaty, so you have to make sure that you follow according to plan. No, things happen, things change. So treaties, agreements also have to be flexible. Minute 319 also introduces the concept of adaptation to adapt to climate change impacts in the Colorado Basin, and that is one of the reasons why it's praised so much, because it's open to change. It's open to accommodate the changes in water that are happening to this basin because of climate change. There are also lesser known minutes, like for example, minute 323, that talks about environmental conservancy around these basins, right? So it is also inclusive of other aspects of transboundary water management beyond water allocation. Also, if you look at the spirit of the letter, the spirit of collaboration between the two countries, you really see in the words that they use and the phrases that they use, they prioritize issues of common interest and not so much positions. They prioritize collaboration and cooperation. There's mutual respect for each other's claim. When Mexico first made the claim to the US saying river basins in Mexico are drying out because of increased irrigation use upstream in the US, it was not shut down, let's say, because obviously the US is a much more powerful country than Mexico, and the possibility that the US would be a bad hegemon in this situation cannot be discounted. But that was not the case. There was mutual respect for each other's claim, and the solutions that the union of the collaboration of Mexico and the US came to, it was not just futuristic. It was not just a solution that got rid of the problem at present, right? So like they had their allocation. They also opened their treaty up to adapt to future situations, but it also catered for past injustices. Mexico had grievances against the US for past injustices, and to cater for this, the US would invest in water infrastructure developments in Mexico as compensation for past injustices. And it was agreed that these past injustices would not be raised, but in effect, they were dealt with, right? So this is also, this is a treaty, an example of how a treaty, a flexible treaty, can be very helpful to accommodate differences, but it also shows us that we can't just move on from the past, right? Injustices, things that went wrong in the past have to be catered for, not necessarily monetarily, but at least they have to be acknowledged. This is a critical lesson to take from the Colorado River Basin. There are many other grand lessons to take from, and I think we have a talk just dedicated to how to how the collaboration between the US and Mexico resulted in this 1944 agreement. So I haven't gone deep into it, but I thought these four things, the adaptability, the priority, the mutual respect, and the catering for past injustices could be lessons in the Nile Basin that we can take, because God knows we have our own past injustices and past traumas to deal with. The Yukon River Basin. This is a river basin shared between the US and Canada. So here, the US is a downstream state, Canada is an upstream state. Granted that both of these countries are developed countries, they have a good relationship in all other aspects, but what I find fascinating about this river basin case is the use of indigenous knowledge and engagement for water governance. This is a very futuristic, this is a very ahead of its time project, in the sense that it went back to the people who were living in the river basin before, the indigenous people, to tap into their knowledge and to actually engage them in the governance practices. It gave power to the community, so power to the community that was living in this basin, right? So the indigenous community. And this points to the next phase in the evolution of transboundary water management, right? So we've had the principle, the doctrine of the absolute territorial sovereignty, which we scrapped, absolute territorial sovereignty, which we scrapped. Right now, we're dealing with limited territorial sovereignty, where we acknowledge equitable rights of all countries, but we acknowledge the duty not to cause significant harm. The next progression in transboundary water management is to give the management of a transboundary water basin to a community of interest dedicated to the use and management of the basin, comprised of all these basin countries. And Yukon River Basin case did exactly this. It gave power of the water governance to the indigenous communities. It gave the power of managing the transboundary water governance in this basin to the Yukon River Intertribal Council, YRITWC. And this, granted, like the situation was not very severe to begin with, but it's a huge step in the right direction, I might add. A community of interest which is dedicated to the management and the management of the basin is the way forward. That is what that specialists and researchers in transboundary water see as the next progression of transboundary water management or water governance. This makes the case actually that a community of interest, this next phase in transboundary water management, actually makes sense, and it's the possible next way. It's the possible next phase that we have to move on to. So tapping into indigenous communities and making sure that they're engaged in the governance process. This is definitely a lesson that we can take for the Nile Basin as well, because we've lived for more than 3,000 years. We've all had grand civilizations that were based off of the Nile. And so with that comes years and years and years of indigenous knowledge. And we can definitely tap into that and see how we can contextualize it to our modern times and how it can be helpful to solve our modern day problems. There are plenty other cases. These are like the ones I mentioned are like the big ones, but case studies in China, Bhutan, India, and Bangladesh in the Brahmaputra River Basin show us how track 3 diplomacy, or what we call people-to-people diplomacy, can influence the track 1 and track 2 diplomacy that happens on government levels, basin-wide approaches, and inclusion of non-state stakeholders, right? So what we see, especially in the Nile Basin, when we talk about transboundary waters, is that the conversation happens at state levels, at the level of governments. But non-state actors can also, and I stress on can, sometimes they might mess up the discussion, but non-state actors, NGOs, civil societies, all of these organizations can play a positive role in moving the conversation forward. And we can see that in the case study in China, Bhutan, India, and Bangladesh. You can also see the Kura-Aras River Basin between Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Iran. Joint fact-finding, not just sharing of information, but refinding of the information. Refinding of the information, research of the information can be a very good starter for collaboration. And this can be helpful in the Nile Basin as well, because we're even debating on whether the annual flow of the Nile is 84 billion cubic meters, right? Because this is a number documented as measured at as 1, and this is an old number. So joint fact-finding, coming together and making sure that what we know about the basin is right, updating it, and then reciprocal information sharing. This can be helpful, and we saw that in the case in the Kura Aras River Basin, in enhancing their institutional capacity, involving non-state actors, and including adaptive approaches. These are all lessons that we can take from this lesson. But institutional capacity, I want to stress on that, because we saw the reason the Senegal and the Niger River Basin were successful was because they had river organizations with teeth, powerful river organizations which were able to impact change. That is not the case in the Nile Basin. The NBI, the Nile Basin Initiative, is there, and because it's there, it has done a lot of good, but in all honesty, it's not an institution with teeth. It doesn't have so much say. So increasing institutional capacity, making sure we have the river basin organizations, excuse me, river basin organizations with power, with authority, that's very important. Excuse me. Joint fact-finding and information sharing, we see this repeatedly in many basins across the world. The Baikal Basin between Russia and Mongolia, the Merik River Basin in Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. All of these things, information sharing, collaboration, being open, and fact-finding, joint fact-finding, these seem to pave the way for more open, more collaborative, more forward-looking collaboration. And of course, we can't stop without mentioning the Itaipu Dam between Brazil and Paraguay, another towering example of how co-owned infrastructures and trade can be a good way of managing transboundary waters. So these are case studies. But when we think about transboundary waters, one of the major things that pops up is treaties, right? And treaties are these agreements between countries. And for the most part, wherever there are treaties, there is a reduced likelihood of conflict. So we like treaties. Treaties are good. And notable examples, we can see the US-Mexico treaty that we just mentioned earlier. And we can also think about the India-Pakistan water treaty. Notably in history, India and Pakistan are historical enemies. They've gone through numerous wars. But the water treaty between India and Pakistan, after they signed it in the 1960s, it survived almost 2.5 wars while these countries went all out on their wars. So treaties can be a very strong ways to govern transboundary waters. The disadvantage to treaties, however, is that they can be rigid, and most of the time they are. And rigidity in treaties, that is one of the biggest downfalls. When it comes to transboundary waters. Another thing is treaties often tend to be ambiguous, right? Some governments, organizations intentionally or unintentionally introduce ambiguity. Sometimes it's constructive, sometimes not, but ambiguous language in treaties, that is also one of the pitfalls in treaties. And the success of treaties also depends on political stability and the economic strength of countries, right? So this map, so there's this theory that says politically stable and economically developed countries can make more workable treaties, while if the political stability is shaky and the economic resources are not so much, then it's not so, it doesn't really paint a good future for the success of the treaties. And I know this map is not very visible, but you can see the Nile Basin here. Stability-wise, blue and green is more stable, red and yellow is less stable, and obviously it's a region of really fragile stability. And economic aspects-wise, we're not very economically developed. So for the Nile Basin, the combination is of these two things: the political stability and economic development. The combination is not in our favor. It's actually a very violent combination, right? So it's a deadly combination. The odds are not in our favor for treaties to work for us. So we have to be very, very conscious when we're thinking about using treaties, especially about rigidity and functionality and ambiguity in the management of transboundary waters. So I got most of the information from the information about many of the UN.
Please mute antenna.
From a UN database, and they have sort of extracted succinct lessons, UN to-dos and UN not to-dos, what to do and what not to do. And as you can also synthesize on your own, involving stakeholders at multiple levels, data sharing, fact-finding, a strong basin level organization, including developing trust between countries, even though that's a big question mark. How do we develop trust? Capitalizing in common problems and windows of opportunity, involving full stakeholders, not just a few, being inclusive, and capacity building of stakeholders and river basin organizations. These were some of the benefits, some of the to-dos, right? Some of the overarching things that were seen as commonalities between successful transboundary river basin management. What not to do is to exclude key players, right? To have inclusive systems, to have fragmented policies, like dealing with small problems when in fact we have bigger problems and we need an integrated policy. Having river basin authorities without legal authority, without any authority, right? That's a pitfall. That's something that we should not do. A mismatch between scope and scale. We can't be talking about pennies when we have larger problems at hand, right? So the scale at which we talk has to match the scope. So the scope and scale mismatch is something we have to look out for. Fixed water allocation is a big no-no when it comes to the UN, right? Because flexibility, given that population is changing, economies are growing, and climate change is making our water resources more unpredictable, fixed water allocations are big pitfalls to avoid. Unclear dispute resolution mechanisms, leaving it to ad hoc processes and sort of saying, let's see how this goes. That's also a pitfall that the UN actually advises us to avoid. Unilateral developments, these are the last resorts, right? Unilateral developments won't get us anywhere. The aim is for integrated, for collaborative use, and lack of trust. This is a big problem. And if we were to gauge, to sort of grade how Nile Basin is doing on all of the to-dos and not to-dos, you can see we're doing everything that we're not supposed to be doing, but in terms of things that favor collaboration, we're not doing so great. We do have, we're not doing so great. For the most part, we do have a basin-wide organization, but it's not strong. There's a severe lack of trust between countries. We don't capitalize on windows of opportunity and common problems, but rather we are very position-based and seek to capitalize on country interest. We don't have full stakeholder involvement. Mostly talks about that now happens at government levels, and we don't have. Until recently, we did not have an inclusive framework where we could even talk about transboundary water management. Data and information sharing is a big issue. Reciprocal data and information sharing is a big issue. It's like data is again, I guess this also roots from the lack of trust between the countries, but data sharing, finding data, that's a big issue in the Nile Basin. So we can see we're not doing so great. We're doing everything that we're not supposed to be doing, but not so much on the right front. But the benefit that the Nile Basin has, again, the benefit of being late is that we can learn from other basins. So the Nile is an enigma. It's like, not to take away from the complexities of the problem, the Nile is a case in its own. It's a league in its own. Transboundary water management is complex everywhere, but then the Nile is something else, right? So for one, there's extreme dependency on the water. Some of these countries are wholly in the water or wholly in the basin. For example, Uganda, 98% of the water lies in the basin. Egypt and Sudan, extremely dependent on the water. Ethiopia contributes more than 86% of the water, but barely uses it. These discrepancies make the situation worse, make the situations complicated. So there's a big discrepancy between endowments, what countries have, and what they demand. And there's also a big discrepancy between what water is available and the dependency, the need in the countries. Not to mention the historical baggage. We all have glorious histories in the Nile Basin, very ancient histories, world-renowned histories, but there is also baggage that comes with colonialism, baggage and trauma, collective trauma that comes with colonialism, slavery, and all the history that we share. Residual injustices that are still entrenched today in the water management, things that came from the 1900s, things that came from the involvement of the UK and France and Belgium, all of these things, they're still there. The entitlement and the resentment, all of it roots from these residual injustices. And we need to consider all of them. we can't introduce any intervention in the Nile Basin without actually acknowledging that these things are there. It's not just physical, it's not just technical, it's not just scientific. All of these things have to be acknowledged. And Professor Aaron Wolf, he's one of the biggest persons, the biggest names in transboundary water management. He has this framework called Four Worlds. It's actually a framework that is used in conflict management. And he says, water is not just physical, right? So there's the physical water, the water that we see, that we feel, which dictates the positions that countries have. But then there's also mental water, the values that we attach with water. We talk about maximizing efficiency, getting the best use of the water, right? So the management of the water, that's mental water. And these two, physical and mental water, are for the most part what we deal with. But then there's emotional water. There are interests, there are water has to do with sovereignty, what has to do with power, with history, with culture. And then there's the spiritual element of water. I don't think there's any religious sect or spiritual sect which doesn't have some element of water in its rituals. And water is something that actually connects us. And in the Nile Basin, that's actually true. These countries in the Nile Basin are literally tied by the basin, and one river, one people. The motto of the Nile Basin is actually a very good exemplification of the case that we see in the Nile. So he says, Professor Aaron Wolf says, when we're trying to manage transboundary waters, we can't just deal with the physical and mental water, but we have to deal with all of it. And a very good example happened in the Jordan Basin. So the Jordan Basin is shared by Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and I missed the third part. I missed the fourth country. But in the efforts of recognizing all of these elements of water, during the negotiations, for example, Israel was demanding for a hardcore allocation, thinking about projects and scarcity, and how do we deal with the impending doom and the impending scarcity that we are facing. But on the other hand, Israel and Palestinians, the Jordanians and the Palestinians were demanding, acknowledge our sovereignty, acknowledge our demands, acknowledge our rights, our dignities, our history, our legitimacy in the water, our stake in the water first, before we even talk about project and before we even talk about allocation. And this was something that was not comprehensible for Israel. So like, oh, hey, we are in conflict situation, we are in scarcity situation. There's no point talking about rights and history and whatnot, but no. And that caused a deadlock, actually. Palestinians and Jordanians were demanding sovereignty and rights and legitimacy. Israel really wanted to go forward. And that was a deadlock. This was a deadlock between the physical and the mental versus the emotional water. And the solution that they came up with was to actually invent a new legal term that they used in their treaty. It's called rightful allocation. So it's basically a combination of allocation, what Israel was demanding for, but also rights, sovereignty, legitimacy for the Palestinian and Jordanians, right? So this might look like a very simple gesture, but it was what broke the deadlock in the Jordan Basin. And it was what allowed them to move forward. And they did come up with an allocation. They did come up with multiple projects to manage the scarcity that they had in the Jordanian Basin. But this example makes the point that we do have to deal with the emotional, the mental, the spiritual, and the physical water, not just one aspect of it. So as I said, when I started my talk, this isn't a prescriptive, it wasn't a prescriptive presentation. I'm not here to say, let's do this, and that, and the Nile Basin will be okay. No, every basin, solutions to every basin have to be tailor-made. I stress on the contextual solution. We always have to think about the context that we're applying to. But as we saw from many of the examples that I tried to show, there are overarching things that we see that work in many areas, and that things that we can stay away from, right? So my suggestions and where my research lies is on how to find the management aspect, on how to find equitable and reasonable ways to use the water, following the lines of hydrological boundaries, right? So think about capitalizing the resources of the basin, not just particular parts of the basin in particular countries, and then make sure that there is an equitable way to share these basins, to share these benefits, bringing the benefits back to political boundaries. We can't deny the fact that we do have political boundaries, and these political boundaries cross with hydrological boundaries. But if we want to get the maximum benefit out of our water, we have to think in terms of hydrological boundaries first, and then sort of lower these benefits within the political boundaries, right? And to do that, we have to find a mechanism on dealing with what is equitable, what is reasonable, how much, who gives how much, all of that stuff. We also have to think about climate proofing our basin and including flexibility. Right now, as things stand, even though it's contested, the 1959 agreement is what is there dictating the allocation of water in the Nile Basin. That's a very flexible agreement. That's a very rigid agreement, my bad, not flexible. That's a very rigid agreement. For one, it's not inclusive, but the waters are X for 55.5 for Egypt, 18.5 for Sudan. Given the impending climate change issues, these waters are not going to be enough even for Sudan and Egypt, let alone other countries coming into it. So we have to think about adaptability. We have to think about flexible treaties, not volumetric allocations. We have to think about climate proofing the basin. And this includes thinking about adaptive options, ensuring that there's a menu of options on the table to choose from should situations change. So we have to anticipate scenarios. And finally, and we really, really need this in the Nile Basin, not just dealing with the physical water, but also including the emotional water in our discussions. There's a big trauma, there's history. The entitlements and the needs of the basin countries are different. Upstream countries, I can speak for Ethiopia and many of the upper riparian countries, demand that their legitimate rights to the Nile water first be acknowledged before moving on to the other nuances of the agreement. Downstream countries, Egypt and Sudan, given that they have been dependent on the Nile waters for millennia, they want that their security for the water be acknowledged before moving on to the nuances of transboundary water agreement. Both of these claims are legitimate. Both of these claims comes from a deep-seated fear and mistrust, and essentially very human emotions of fear and anxiety, and they are justified and they need to be acknowledged for any physical, scientific, technical interventions, even political interventions to work. Thank you so very much. I feel like I have spoken for hours, but I'm open to questions if you should have any.
Hi, everybody. If you have any questions, you can either raise your hand or feel free to send the questions directly to Mekdelawit in the chat or to Wossenu, who I think he might have actually dropped off. So he's going to be coming back on shortly.
Seems like we don't have any questions.
I have a question, please.
Yes, sir. Okay.
First, I would like to thank Ms. Mekdelawit for this very good presentation about the transboundary river basins, because we have many problems now in the world. More than 50% of the people in the world live in transboundary river basins. And probably in the future, we may have water wars. There are some critical problems, like in the Nile Basin, in the Tigray and Furat, between Iraq and Turkey, and the many Palestine area, and many others. For the Nile Basin, I was hoping to hear about the successful agreements in the Nile Basin. For example, we have a very successful agreement between Egypt and Sudan. When we built the high dam in 1970, we have an agreement to share some water that used to flow to the Mediterranean Sea. And we shared this water. And also, we have an agreement between Egypt and Uganda when they wanted to build the Owens Dam on Victoria Lake. They shared the information. We discussed the project, and we found it's good for Uganda, and there is no problem or any harm for Egypt. So that's why we have this agreement. So, and also we have 6 agreements between Egypt and Ethiopia. But the problem now, Ethiopia denies all of these agreements. The first one was in 1891, the first agreement between Egypt and Ethiopia. And all these agreements, Ethiopia was free without any colonization at that time. But the problem now, the government in Ethiopia denies all these agreements. So I want to probably from our speaker to shed more light on these agreements. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, sir. And I have a whole dedicated presentation on the agreements in the Nile Basin and their implications for the current water use in the Nile Basin. I do agree with you. We do have some good practices, even though I can raise counterpoints for many of the agreements that you raised. The main issue that I think is the problem in the Nile Basin is a mismatch of scale when we're talking about water management in the Nile Basin. We have a deep-seated main problem that we often don't deal with, sort of the elephant in the room, but then we want to talk about these, in many cases, very useful, but then very minor agreements that don't move the needle one way or the other when we're hoping for conversation. I don't think that's very helpful. As you mentioned earlier, there have been instances in history where collaborative agreements have been done on the Nile water, but for the most part, these agreements were very exclusionist. It was often done between a subset of countries and not the whole Nile Basin countries, when in fact the jurisdiction of the agreements, it did include the whole of the Nile Basin. So there's a big scaling mismatch. And for the agreements that you raised between Ethiopia and Egypt, indeed, these agreements have been there since 1884. And since 1884 all the way up to 1993 and 2010 on the 2015 for the Declaration of Principles, we've had a set of agreements between Egypt and Sudan. And it's not, I beg to differ with you on the fact that Ethiopia denies these agreements. No, it's not a denial, but it's more of how the ambiguities and interpretations in treaties and flexible treaties without clear cuts and sharp statements in treaties can actually be interpreted different ways by these two countries. I can mention the issue of the 1902 agreement, where the Amharic version of the agreement says one thing, the English says the other. I can mention also the 1902 agreement, where the Amharic version does not include Sudan in the agreement, Sudan in the terms of the agreement, where the the English version does. So these have to do more with the nature and with the ambiguities and the holes in the loopholes in the treaty, rather than the government of Ethiopia saying we don't acknowledge them. Ethiopia has been a free country throughout all of all of its history. Indeed, like you mentioned, Ethiopia was free when it signed this agreements. And so where Ethiopia, to the best of my knowledge, as far as I know, is not denying any of these agreements based on the premise of them being a colonial agreements. The colonial agreements does not apply to many of these agreements, but the 1929 and the 1959 agreements, and for good reasons. So in all honesty, if we want to move the conversation in the Nile Basin forward, of course, there have been good instances in the basin, but we're not by any measure, by any stretch, attacking or dealing with the major problem in the Nile Basin, which is inclusion of all basin countries and understanding and acknowledgement of the rights and the demands of all the Nile Basin riparian countries. And that has to form the foundation for anything in the Nile Basin to happen. We can't start working, we can't start discussing on a platform where all of the water is technically, for all intensive purposes, allocated and used by downstream countries of Egypt and Sudan, while all the upstream countries, the 9 upstream countries, which contribute all of the Nile waters, actually to all intensive purposes use none. So I think, in my opinion, that forms the basis of the problem. And that is the scale, the mismatch in scale. The problem is this big, where we're talking about pennies and agreements on dams and agreements on infrastructures. While these agreements are still valid, still valuable, still useful, they are in no way attacking the main problem in the Nile Basin. And so my apologies, because the scope of this study, this presentation, was to showcase international case studies and not so much focus on them now. And you are justified in saying there are some good practices in the Nile Basin, and I have raised some of this in my other presentations, but there's a big mismatch of scale in the Nile Basin when it relates to really genuinely solving the problem. We're talking about pennies and dimes here when we have a huge problem at hand, which we normally don't even start to touch.
Sorry, my internet was out on the last.
No problem, sir.
I'm back again, but the video is not working. So I'd like to thank Mekdelawit for her excellent presentation. I think you have done some questions in between until I come. Let's go to Abtew for the next question.
Thank you for the opportunity, Mekdelawit. As usual, this is an excellent presentation again. I heard you many times, and this is also one of the great presentations that I heard on the Nile, the river especially, and now expanded on the experiences of transboundary rivers issues. Just in passing, let me do one comment regarding the previous person's question. He implied that, Egypt and Sudan, just, to save the water from being wasted to the Mediterranean River, let's have some agreement and share it. But he failed to mention that agreement that was done at the colonial time was not inclusive. In fact, it was very exclusive, and that I like to mention in passing. But the main reason why I came here to ask is, Mekdelawit, you mentioned about the transboundary water sharing between Jordan and Israel. I heard that, and I read that the agreement between Jordan and Israel is so effective that Israel is exporting water. Imagine Israel, a dry land, exporting water to Jordan. And that's because of the desalination advancement in Israel, and also the potable reuse of water. And these technologies and desalination and reuse is very much advanced. And I think one of the solutions here could be, as I think it was mentioned, several times also, Egypt has this potential to develop the desalination because of its large area of the coastline, and also lowering the wastage of the water and the reuse as well. This is one thing that I wanted to mention here. And what's your take on this? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And absolutely. As it relates, well, I'll leave the comments that you mentioned for you had for the previous speaker, and I do beg for us to move away from these kind of discussions and try to look forward, because today's presentation was to take lessons from elsewhere. We have been, like the discussion in the Nile, we have been over this over and over again. So in this presentation, I was hoping to move you guys forward. But as it relates to the Jordan, indeed, the agreement between the Jordan, Israeli, and Palestinians did help it did help in making sure that water trade between these two countries, which largely has to do with Israel's potential to desalination, that Israel actually gets to sell water to the Jordan, but the peace and the agreement and the stability ensured by means of the water arrangement, the water agreement, actually made it better, easier for this desalinated water trade between these two countries. So I do agree that the effectiveness of the Transboundary Water Agreement actually paved way for further economic development between these two countries, even though how Israel sells water to Jordan has more to do with this desalination potential rather than the Transboundary Water Agreement. But in terms of solidifying the relationship, the peace, stability in the region, actually, it was a very monumental agreement for sure. And as it relates to how we can collectively move how we can make sure that we use the water sustainably, again, I've been on this on many of my presentations. Exploring alternative resources is definitely part of the solution. We can't just cling to the Nile. We have to think about better rainfall harvesting, desalination, wastewater reuse. All of these are definitely part of the solution for sure. So is it reducing wastage and increasing efficiency of water use in many of these countries, not just Egypt, but also Sudan, Ethiopia, and also these upcoming Nile water users. So increasing efficiency, making sure we get the best of the water, capitalizing in resource on location efficiency, growing things where they're supposed to grow, ensuring on location efficiency to get the maximum out of the water, wastewater reuse, thinking about alternative water resources. That includes wastewater reuse, that includes desalination, that includes enhanced rainwater harvesting, that includes use of groundwaters, which have been untapped for quite some time now. So that definitely forms the basis of the set of the solutions, like our menu of solutions in the Nile Basin, if we want to move forward. So I do agree with your comments, sir. Yeah.
Next question is from Henok, followed by Alab. Maybe you'll address both of them. Go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Mekdelawit. That was really, really insightful, I thought. I just wanted to draw on a couple of concepts from public policy around path dependencies, one, and the other is the theory of punctuated equilibrium, right? So, path dependency essentially says that over time, actors grow comfortable in the status quo and the positions that's been established across time. And with this comes, quite entrenched discourses, power relationships, and interests, which are very difficult then for the different actors to move away from. I think this is really symptomatic of what we've seen with the Nile Basin negotiations and all the problems around it. So the theory of punctuated equilibrium essentially says that this equilibrium can be punctuated by some focusing events, and usually this comes from the global level with public policy, at least. So the global level can set a new tone a new way of doing things, can set examples, can open up, breakthroughs. Do you see that with the way the global actors have engaged with the Nile Basin? I personally see it as very problematic. Historically, the global level has closed doors to certain actors in favor of others. It's been quite partial. Does it even have the credence to involve in a constructive way with the way these negotiations are going? Or do you see other ways, or is your hope around other innovations as was being discussed just now with desalination and other things, increasing the abundance and the possibilities around that? Or is it when the actors go into conflict and they get tired of that they come back to more constructive engagement? I just wanted to hear your reflections, but thank you so much again for the really, really informative discussion. Thanks.
Dr. Wossenu, may I respond to this question first?
Okay, all right, go ahead.
That's a lot. I think these are absolutely two concepts that we can definitely see the application in the Nile Basin, and definitely important to take stock of. The path dependency that you just explained, that's exactly what we see in the basin now. We have been in the status quo, in this routine for so long, we find it so hard to move out of. And this is where what I mentioned earlier about capitalizing in moments of change, capitalizing on crisis situations, right? That is, so crisis situations, as bad as they sound, they do allow us to radically change, radically move away from what has been established. And in the Senegal, many of the other river basins as well, conflict situations offer that crisis situation, offer that momentum, offer that window of opportunity when we can actually divert from our path dependency, our ways of the ways that we are actually used to. So I find that fascinating, and I'll definitely read up on that. But for sure, I think capitalizing on momentums, windows of opportunity, like what we have now in the Nile Basin, that is our way out, as far as I see it, and off the top of my head, our way out of path dependency. And for the second concept, punctuated equilibrium, I also find this quite fascinating. It seems like the world has agreed on this basic principles of equitable and reasonable use when it comes to the general agreements. But when it comes to the Nile, the actions, what we see in action seem to be reinforcing not equitable and reasonable use, but as you rightly mentioned, and as I hate to say it, but it's actually the case, partial use. And they seem to reinforce the current state of events, the current status quo, which is actually obviously not equitable, obviously not reasonable, and definitely not collaborative or inclusive. So I see a dichotomy here. On one hand, we have these international principles which do acknowledge every riparian state have rights. But on the other hand, we see some actions, backhanded actions, arm twisting, international diplomacy, all of that stuff, trying to entrench, trying to solidify the current status quo in the region, which really don't go together. So I do understand you questioning, you and many people at that, questioning the credence, the credibility of these international institutions to be able participants in the discussions of transboundary waters as it relates to the Nile. But fact of the matter is we can't live in isolation, right? So everything has to be done in the context of international relations. So we can't just cut international relations and international actors out. And given the economic conditions of the Nile Basin, it's very unlikely that we will be able to move collectively as a basin forward without the help of international community. That's the sad truth. That's the uncomfortable truth. The thing that we have to do is, though, bring this injustice, bring this feeling of injustice on one side to the forefront, acknowledge it, right? And then make sure that the traits that worked in other basins, for example, international intervention helped the Senegal Basin. International intervention helped India and Pakistan come to this agreement, come to that treaty, which survived 2.5 wars, all-out wars between these two countries, right? So I don't think sugarcoating it or putting it under the rug serves the purpose. It's actually important to call it out, just like you did. But it's also important to acknowledge that we can't do this on our own. We can't do this in isolation as the Nile Basin alone. So we have to find a compromise solution where the international community acknowledges how some of the parties in the Nile Basin feel about international intervention, while at the same time, we in the Nile Basin become somehow amenable to the demands of the international community in order to get a win-win solution. That's not ideal, but that's how I see the way forward. But thank you. These are really, really intriguing points for me, and I'll definitely read up on them. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Adam has to go to another meeting, so he has withdrawn his question. Anyone who has questions or comment? I want to say some on the previous question. The involvement of international agencies or countries in the Nile Basin issue. There is one experience already, which is Washington, D.C. Draft agreement and meeting, which was completely based towards downstream countries, and there is already that experience. And on Ethiopia side, sticking with the African Union than involving any other agencies, international, like the United Nations, Europe, or the United States. So in my view, currently, I think the Nile water resources mixed up with land resources, rare element resources in Africa. And that's why it is completely complicated and very hard to come up with basin water management plans like the previous experiences in other countries. So the likelihood of conflict or the current conflict expanding is very high, but still it is the right way to propose the advantage of developing basin management organizations and create cooperation and sharing, which will be beneficial for both upstream and downstream countries. Otherwise, as population grow and with no agreement, the status quo is dynamic. Egypt is diverting water out of the basin. Ethiopia will start diverting water out of the basin, if not from the main Blue Nile, from the tributaries. Tanzania has planned to divert water from the basin. Kenya might do the same thing from Victoria, and Uganda might have other plans. So the status quo is developing, is dynamic, and that will be the direction without any basin water management organization or plan. So this will be probably the likelihood path that it will go as I can see it. If anyone has questions or comments, we'll continue. Otherwise, probably we'll finish right here.
Excuse me. May I have just in 1 minute, if there is a time?
Okay.
Okay. Just a general recommendation. There is a fact that more than 50% of the water of rivers in the world flow to the seas without any benefit. For example, Congo River has 1,300 billion cubic meters flow to the ocean without any benefit. Others, in average, about 50%. So we need to find a way to use this water. This water is for human being on the planet. And we need, my recommendation is to find or to have a new organization related to the United Nations to find a way to use this water, because the water on the planet is fixed, it's constant, but the human beings or the population increases with time. we could have a water war in the future. So that's why we have to have an action right now. An organization related to the United Nations to find a way to use this water and also to solve the problems of the transboundary water on the world. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that is a very good suggestion. I think the future will be transboundary, trans-basin water transfer. The United States Western states are very dry, so much dry, everything is burning right now, while you have the Mississippi and other big rivers going into the ocean. So from the fixed amount of water, the direction, probably the most engineering solution will be to move water around and bring the Congo to join the Nile, also one alternative. But the water war has already started. That can happen if there is a will to cooperate and solve the problem together. So that is the most viable solution globally.
If I may add,
Sorry, I dropped one text message in the chat box for the sake of time, so that if the organizer can connect, share the questions to the presenter. I thank you.
I don't see a question on the chat. Can you go ahead and?
yeah, me neither.
Okay. What will be the role of the upstream countries in the context of this negotiation? Is there any experience of having all the concerned countries to negotiate the issue on the same table? Of course, this is a general question. That's my concern, because I haven't seen any just great effort from the upstream countries to sit together with, for example, Ethiopia, to push forward for the common goal. That was my question. I thank you.
If I understand correctly, what you're saying is because you already pointed to the fact that these upstream countries are pushing for collaboration. If I understand you correctly, you're asking what upstream countries can do to ensure collaboration with these downstream countries, because what is their role is a very general question, like you said, and they don't have a role. They're important stakeholders. Each basin, each country in a basin, by virtue of just it being part of that basin, has a stake in it, has a share, has a fair share in it, and with that comes its own responsibilities. But if it relates to what each country can do in order to push for collaboration, not much. Collaboration is a mutual effort, right? Well, as the saying goes, it takes two to tango. So in the Nile Basin, it takes 11 to have a comprehensive, sustainable water basin arrangement. So what can one country do? What can two countries do? Not much, but a critical mass of countries, as we saw in the CFA, for example, 6 countries coming together to actually sign, and 4 countries, now 5 countries ratifying the CFA, moves the discussion forward. Granted that the CFA won't be very functional without the 2 major players, Sudan and Egypt, in it. So collaboration really needs like the willing participation, the good spirit participation of all of these countries, but a critical mass of countries, for example, in this case, these upstream riparian countries, can help to push on the status quo, to incite communication, discussion, and collaboration. But there isn't much that these countries on their own can do to foster collaboration. And this leads to unilateral developments. When countries become frustrated with the lack of cooperation, they resort to developing their water resources on their own. And this is what we saw with the GERD. It was after 10 years of negotiations, 10 years of studies, on how to develop a co-owned infrastructure on the border. And last minute, Egypt and Sudan declined that offer. And then it was after that that Ethiopia, out of frustration and out of seeing lack of fruit from these collaborative efforts for 10 years now, for more than 10 years back then when the GERD was first initiated, that it resorted to a unilateral development, right? But the GERD was originally planned to be a collaborative multi-purpose project between Ethiopia and Sudan and Egypt. And this was already a study being done by the Eastern Nile Technical Regional Office, a part of the Nile Basin Initiative. So countries cannot force collaboration, but the union, the coming together of countries can provide a favorable platform for collaborations. But the lack of collaboration actually leads to unilateral developments, which we don't really want going forward, because unilateral developments are very narrow-minded, right? Myopic. They don't capitalize on the wider resources of the water, and that's not what we want forward. But building on the comment from the previous speaker, I have to say, it's not the United Nations that can solve the issues in transboundary water basins. The UN tried to solve the problem. And at the end of the day, when they realized that they couldn't, they gave the mandate to each and every transboundary water basins in the world, because each transboundary water basin is unique in its own. It's a league in its own. And the solutions and the interventions have to be tailor-made. And so we can't, I think it's very naive and futile to expect solutions from a UN level institution or from an organization like the UN to solve the issues of transboundary waters and to come up with mechanisms. Now, it doesn't work that way. Every solution, every intervention has to be tailor-made for each solution. And the UN 1997 Convention actually says as much. It does provide general principles, working principles, so equitable use, reasonable use, no significant harm, and factors to consider. But as far as finding quantifiable, usable frameworks for the basin goes, it is up to the basins to come up with that themselves. So I don't think the solution is going to come from the UN. I just wanted to say that.
All right, I think we might finish it here. Dr. Lamma, go ahead, unmute, and should be the
Yes.
last.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Wossenu. Thanks very much, Mekdelawit. I really appreciate your presentation, and some of the questions I have been covered one way or another, and I don't want to revisit them because of the extensive coverage you had. I just recently, I thought of something that I thought I would share with the group here, with the Ethiopians, and hopefully you'll come to see my point. And that is, lately, I am beginning to see or realize there will be solution eventually, but it takes time. And in the meantime, what I think we have to recognize and do is the solutions come through, or desirable solutions, let us say, from our perspective, comes only through our own efforts. Therefore, we have to constantly look for ways to influence the situation and help the solution or shape the solution. What do I mean by that? I'll give you an example. For example, the Nile Basin Initiative came about through the help of United Nations, Canada, and so forth. These are international organizations. We don't think, the UN, for instance, have been helpful in so many ways, and we have heard complaints in this forum today. But by Ethiopians being involved in the Nile Basin Initiative tenaciously and explaining things, the CFA and the principle are examples of points where we brought our points, and then almost everybody agreed, except maybe for Egypt and Sudan. They didn't agree, and they will not agree until their time comes that they have to find it's in their interest to agree. For another example is this meet. We heard our one of the participants today saying Ethiopia doesn't agree, Ethiopia refuses. This is not the first time we hear that. The accounts that the Nile Basin Initiative and Ethiopia's step since GERDS has come about, the accounts that Ethiopia has taken steps in changing is not recognized by anybody from our friends, brothers in Egypt, or in their sphere of influence. But Ethiopia has to continue showing the positive influence Ethiopia has been doing. In a recent meeting, I heard a guy saying Ethiopia never changes its position. There is an article going around saying Ethiopia doesn't accept any change. Even the rate of filling, they accuse Ethiopia of not accepting changes. Ethiopia proposed we could have filled with the water available. The hydrology allows us to fill the reservoir within 2 to 4 years. That was our initial estimate. That's hydrology. We don't have to disagree too much with that. But it changed it from that to 4 to 7 years. And it is not understood by the Egyptian academics, people in water resources. And they don't read the developments in this. But then it is our duty to push that information to be available to those who do not see it. And that is where I say our efforts should be to make that information available. Information exchange does not have to be always official. The information that we need to bring out, the information that we seek, we have to make that available. And I would like to say, we have to take that to be our challenge. And the countries upstream, we complain they don't participate. We should take our own example. The Ethiopia's effort to develop the Nile did not start the last 10 years. It goes 2-3 times that long when it started. But as our need for the Nile water and resources become urgent, we went the extra mile to make it happen, to the extent of even contributing, constraining our own budgets, the citizens doing that when the world financing companies or banks and institutions didn't give us. That is an example to me when the need becomes necessary, the efforts will come, the information sharing will come, but then it's for us to recognize this is our time of need. That's why we need urgently to push, and Ethiopia have to do the legwork at this time. And it is my friend Abbas and others, we don't curse them, but we have to provide them with information. Hopefully they will be receptive to the positive news that we can. I took a little bit too long.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lama. I might say some words in his response. The current disagreement is trying to have a basin agreement on a reservoir. That is the whole problem. You can't have a legally binding agreement on how to operate a reservoir because there are variables that you can't put in any legal document: climate, weather, maintenance, safety, and you'll go to court the first year of operation. So it is good to separate and have a basin management plan and legally binding water sharing agreement. than how to operate a hydroelectric power dam. If these things are clear, you can have how to fill it, how to operate it. Ethiopia has to provide its guidelines, and the downstream countries have to put their concern. They can come to agreement and operate a hydroelectric dam and separate totally who gets how much water. And that's the only way you can get any outcome from the current negotiation. So thank you, Mekdelawit, for your wonderful presentation, and make sure to join us on October 8th for a good presentation on the GERD. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for being here. Have a nice day.
Thank you.